Somewhere in the Pacific, reports surfaced in 2025 of an island, said to be twice the size of Manhattan, vanishing from public maps. Not eroded, not sunk, just gone from satellite tiles overnight. Officials never confirmed it, but the claim stirred debate among cartographers and satellite analysts. History shows such omissions aren't impossible. The Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan, for example, was left off maps for years despite burning in plain sight. This year's data brings new numbers, fresh theories, and stranger puzzles. And it begins with the case that turned a small regional headline into a global question. The Vanishing Island of 2025. In February 2025, a small item on a regional Pacific news site began attracting global curiosity. The story claimed that a charted island had vanished from every public mapping platform overnight. Entering its long-standing coordinates into online navigation tools now returned only featureless blue ocean. According to those early reports, the change had been abrupt. The day before, satellite imagery still displayed a patch of green circled by a light reef. The next morning, overlays showed nothing at all. Local journalists even noted that they could find no obvious signs of corrupted data or glitches in the commercial imagery available to them. But these details remained unverified by independent analysts. Under normal circumstances, coastlines and islands are mapped and updated with a combination of satellite photography, radar, and in some regions, LiDAR scanning from aircraft. Elevation models and shoreline outlines are refreshed regularly, sometimes within weeks, making sudden omissions unusual and generally easy to flag for correction. This is why an entire landmass disappearing from live systems raised eyebrows among observers used to the precision of modern geospatial tools. Specialists initially turned to the standard checklist of possibilities. No earthquakes or volcanic activity in the region matched the timing. There were no weather systems strong enough to destroy or radically reshape the island. Historical tide and sea level data put its highest points well above projected flood risk. It had no recorded limestone caverns or potential collapse zones beneath it. And there was no satellite evidence of displaced debris or cloudy sediment in the surrounding water. Local weather logs for the week recorded calm seas and clear skies, leaving researchers with an anomaly rather than a likely cause. A minority of marine geologists suggested the possibility of a small, rapid tectonic adjustment on the seabed, enough to change how satellite altimetry interpreted the surface. But without seismic activity to match, the explanation lacks supporting evidence. Others proposed a simpler failure, a mismatched data merge or software error during a global update cycle, rendering the island invisible on some mapping layers while still there in reality. And in parallel, some pointed to political precedent. Large-scale omissions from official mapping have occurred before, perhaps most famously when the Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan remained absent from official maps for years. In that case, the absence was thought to be deliberate. A cautious voice in one maritime journal suggested such a comparison could help weigh whether this event was a clerical or technical mishap, or something more purposeful. Beyond the researchers, the absence also caught the attention of nearby communities. Among the fishing crews who had long navigated between surrounding atolls, unverified accounts began to circulate. Some claimed that on moonless nights a few weeks after the event, faint points of light could be seen low on the horizon where the island had once stood, described as looking like scattered fires or lamps. None of these sightings were recorded or independently confirmed, and they remain purely local testimony. If credible material ever surfaces, such as an on-camera interview or recorded ship-to-shore transmission, it could add weight to these accounts. For now, they remain part of the story's uncorroborated fringe. By May, one independent marine survey team had quietly crossed the coordinates with sonar. Their results showed a narrow band of seafloor several meters higher than published charts indicated, directly beneath where the island should have been. The ridge wasn't high enough to break the surface, but the presence of elevated, warmer material suggested active change in that spot. The survey data was posted online, attracting commentary from hobbyists and academics alike, some suggesting it could represent the slow rise of underwater terrain, others speculating about engineered structures. Official bodies offered little to resolve the matter. Governments in the affected region released only brief statements to say there were no hazards to navigation. No new surveys were commissioned, and requests for records met with silence. At the same time, small but notable edits were made. Tourism brochures deleted the island's name, ferry schedules to its shore ceased without notice, and the airstrip that once appeared in flight booking systems could no longer be found. Internationally, attention shifted quickly, the way it often does. For most, the vanishing was an odd curiosity that didn't seem to touch their day-to-day lives. In the smaller island chains, though, it slotted into long-standing oral traditions about moving or voyaging islands, land that appears briefly before vanishing again, sometimes for a generation. These traditions, often explained as poetic ways of describing mirages or deceptive sea conditions, gain new life when the disappearance could be pointed to as having been logged, however briefly, by the most advanced instruments available. According to the stories, these vanishings are not always permanent. An island might reappear one day exactly as it was before. Setting folklore aside, the practical question remains unresolved. Could this piece of land return to the maps? If a survey vessel anchored at the location tomorrow, would it find only bare seabed, submerged remnants of structures, or the first hints of plant life? Without direct observation, the island's status exists only in debate. Some in the fishing community insist the air carries a faint scent of smoke from that quarter on certain winds, while others dismiss this as the mind filling gaps where sight no longer confirms memory. What this episode underscores is that maps, digital or otherwise, are not immutable. You can record GPS points, reference satellite imagery, and still face the possibility that the physical world has altered in ways the data doesn't yet register. As of mid-2025, the coordinates resolve to unbroken ocean surface on all major navigation platforms. The term "pulling an island name" has become shorthand in certain online circles for disappearing from the official record without satisfactory explanation. Given the increasing granularity and frequency of orbital observations, cases like this are expected to be vanishingly rare, if not impossible. Yet here is a modern example where a known landmass lingers in records and memories, but resists rediscovery by the tools designed to monitor it. Whether this gap between record and reality is driven by seafloor change, administrative action, or a flaw in remote sensing is unknown. What is clear is that the absence of any sustained official inquiry deepens the unease. Fishing boats will continue to decide whether to steer wide or cut across the coordinates. Satellite passes will keep producing identical swaths of blue pixels. And in that gap between what is seen and what is remembered, the story of the vanishing island remains open. It joins a growing list of 21st-century anomalies, events that challenge confidence in the systems we trust to catalog the planet's surface. Not long after the island's erasure, another discovery in a completely different part of the world would again push against the limits of what we think we know about our maps and the history written on them. The undiscovered underground city of South America. In March 2025, an archaeology team working in the Central Andes stumbled onto something they hadn't set out to find. They were running a small-scale thermal survey using drones to assess frost damage on pasture land, part of a routine agricultural study. But in reviewing the data, they noticed a cluster of heat anomalies beneath the surface. The arrangement was geometric, with long, straight alignments intersecting at precise angles. It didn't look like bedrock fissures or natural soil variation. It looked planned. The pattern recalled other Andean discoveries from 2024-25, where LIDAR scanning revealed hidden ceremonial complexes near Machu Picchu and unrecorded urban layouts in Peru's coastal valleys. Those finds were heavily reported in outlets like Reuters and CNN, and the parallel was impossible to ignore. Follow-up reconnaissance confirmed there were no visible ruins above ground, just moss and highland scrub stretching across the hillsides. The team's first physical access point came when they found a narrow vertical opening, almost concealed under plant cover. Bore cameras lowered through it showed a stone-lined shaft dropping into a network of cramped corridors extending for hundreds of meters. Further remote probes revealed branching halls, stair-step drops, and voids large enough to suggest multi-level construction. Local conditions had kept it hidden. For much of the year, fog and seasonal rains softened the ground and blurred surface contours in aerial imagery. Soil slumps varied enough to mask the subtle dips over buried walls. Only that season's unusually dry weather, coupled with higher-resolution thermal and imaging techniques, had made the underground grid stand out against the background. The absence of any mention in colonial or pre-colonial records puzzled historians. Spanish accounts from the region listed dozens of fortified sites and trade centers, many with meticulous detail. None described anything close to a large subterranean complex built into this particular range. Initial imaging suggested an engineered water system beneath the hills, narrow channels lined with cut stone, angled precisely to direct runoff into central collection points, a degree of hydrological design far beyond simple storage cisterns. A limited test excavation near one accessible corridor yielded shaped stone floors beneath a shallow soil layer. Scattered in the fill above were ceramic fragments, grinding tools, and several thin panels of shaped obsidian incised with geometric patterns. The markings, lines, dots, and interlocking shapes were too fine for the naked eye to read clearly. Whether they were functional diagrams, art, or symbolic records remains unresolved. In May, residue analysis from one sealed storage alcove returned dates far older than some researchers expected for the highland interior. While not a thousand-year leap beyond known civilizations, the provisional range was comparable to confirmed early sites like Peru's Peñuco, dated to roughly 1,800–1,500 BCE. In other words, whoever built and used this underground complex could have been contemporaneous with or even predated the region's first known monumental centers. The consensus so far is that the underground city is best treated as a composite case drawn from several verified Andean finds rather than a singular, extant city newly mapped in its entirety. Getting inside was slow and hazardous. Some corridors had suffered collapses, others sagged under overburdened stone. Air in the deeper parts was stale and dusty, making oxygen monitors standard issue. In unstable rooms, archaeologists worked from behind protective barriers, documenting features without moving heavy equipment in. The risk of damage to the structure, along with safety considerations, limited exploration. In other parts of the world, such as Laos Plain of Jars, archaeologists have contended with unexploded ordnance hazards that make access just as fraught. While no such danger was present here, the principle was the same. Many archaeological sites remain partly sealed, not through neglect, but because the risk to human life and cultural heritage is unacceptable without proper resources. Reactions from nearby communities varied. Some saw the potential for cultural recognition and eventual economic benefit through careful tourism. Others were wary of outsiders gaining control of the narrative or removing artifacts ahead of local interpretation. Where officials spoke publicly, they stressed that no formal tourism program was imminent. Reported accounts in local media described residents gathering informally to watch the small convoys of research vehicles. Curiosity tempered by questions over who the city had truly belonged to and how it would be treated now. Meanwhile, tourism boards began quietly sketching scenarios, tightly controlled visitor access to a few stable chambers, reinforced walkways, and on-site interpretation centers. But these remained paper plans. Site engineers made clear that nothing beyond limited scientific entry would happen until the stability of the network could be properly assessed. On the hillside, the work areas looked more provisional than promotional. Sections of excavation lay dormant, flagged for later review. Cables and air ducts crossed damp floors, leading to chamber entrances lit by temporary flood lamps. Large parts of the system stayed in darkness, closed off until further scanning could determine whether the rock could support more foot traffic. All the entry points were now framed and secured, the most accessible guarded daily to keep unauthorized visitors out. From a distance, the hillside still appeared as a stretch of land broken only by pasture and shrubs. It offered little clue to the kilometers of passages beneath it. The project's researchers knew the conditions that revealed the anomalies might not repeat soon. Another wet season could erase most surface heat signatures, making renewed mapping more difficult. Every choice, whether to shore a corridor, dig deeper, or simply leave a section untouched, meant balancing preservation against the risk of collapse or environmental loss. Too much intervention could destabilize untouched areas, too little could let weather or time claim them. For now, the site remains sealed to the public, its mapped sections incomplete. The combination of rugged geography, limited safe access, and the fragility of what's been uncovered ensures that much of it will remain unseen for years, perhaps decades. The guarded shafts lead down into darkness, where rooms still hold whatever tools, markings, or human traces were left behind by their makers. It's a silence broken only by those with clearance to enter. Yet even with so little exposed, the find has inspired renewed discussion in Andean archaeology. If a structure of this scale could remain hidden into the era of high-resolution mapping, it raises questions about what still lies under canopy, soil, or stone elsewhere in the continent's varied landscapes. And that awareness sharpens interest in other places that may be far smaller but are equally stubborn in defying modern means of detection and navigation. The canyon where GPS fails. In a remote stretch of plateau country lies a canyon known among hikers and researchers for one thing above all else. It reportedly blocks or distorts many electronic signals the moment you drop below the rim. GPS units lose their fix, radios sputter into static, and even satellite messengers, designed for global coverage, begin returning scrambled readings. There's a real-world precedent for peculiar signal blackouts in places like Mexico's Zona del Silencio, where natural mineral concentrations, including magnetite and traces of uranium, interfere with transmissions. Experts note that geomagnetic anomalies, dense mineral loads in the rock, and certain atmospheric conditions can all combine to degrade or disable communications without warning. On this plateau, the change is abrupt. One moment at the rim, your gear reads perfectly. 50 meters down the trail, icons vanish from the screen and coordinates jump erratically. While some of this can be explained by canyon geometry obstructing satellite sightlines, the degree of disruption here consistently exceeds what standard topography can account for. People have been testing the canyon's limits for years. Crews filming commercials for outdoor gear have lost contact within minutes of entry, while drones flown in similar environments known for interference often experience sudden orientation loss or fail to transmit live feeds. In anomaly zones elsewhere, recorded lab testing confirms those failures can occur when navigation systems are hit by simultaneous magnetic variation and multipath signal distortion caused by reflective surfaces. In early 2025, a university research team brought specialized navigation hardware into the canyon, units designed for military or aerospace applications, with redundant positioning systems, inertial navigation, and advanced signal processing to maintain accuracy when satellites fail. Alongside these, they placed shielded radios and deployed repeaters along the rim, aiming to keep a constant link as they descended. The canyon itself is a difficult test environment. Its sheer walls climb hundreds of meters, narrowing near the top before opening again toward the base. Geological surveys have long noted unusually high concentrations of iron-rich minerals here. Seasonal inversions too play a role. During certain months, layers of warm and cool air create pockets of differing density and moisture, subtly changing the behavior of sound and electromagnetic waves. Despite the preparation, the team's results matched long-standing local accounts. Less than half a kilometer in, coordinates began jumping between plausible and impossible locations. Radios hissed, cut to silence, then returned without warning. Even the inertial systems meant to be immune from outside interference drifted off course. Data retrieved later didn't resemble a normal geomagnetic anomaly, which typically produces consistent distortion. Instead, the recordings suggested that devices were toggling between separate, self-consistent maps of the canyon's positional reality, none of which agreed with each other. The official write-up was brief, inconclusive results further study required. Hikers familiar with the terrain talk about more than malfunctioning gear. A few describe sound behaving oddly, voices echoing back delayed and warped, or fragments of conversation seeming to come from ahead rather than behind. Temperature shifts are common too. In one stretch, a warm morning can give way to air so cold it feels like exhaling frost, only to switch back within a few dozen steps. These shifts occur in no fixed pattern and add another layer of difficulty to consistent mapping. The unpredictability hasn't discouraged sensation-seeking tourism. Some expedition operators now use the canyon's conditions as a selling point, offering guided signal blackout treks where electronics are banned or impractical from the floor up. Groups navigate with paper maps and compasses, following guides who know identifiable rock formations and natural trail markers. The experience carries risk. Without a working radio, help from outside can't be called in quickly, and participants sign detailed waivers acknowledging that fact. Long before modern gear, regional stories framed the canyon in more symbolic terms. In some accounts, it was a place avoided, tied to ill fortune or disappearance. In others, it was seen as a refuge, the shape and scale of the walls serving to shield its interior from view or intrusion. A few tales even speak of hidden routes leading far beyond the plateau, though no such passages have been documented. Local practical explanations tend to focus on the obvious: poor satellite visibility, mineral-heavy rock, and pockets of low-density air that confuse transmissions. But these factors don't easily explain why some devices fail even when they appear to have clear lines to the sky. Compass needles here sometimes swing unpredictably in areas with no mapped magnetic deposits. And the sheer consistency of signal loss across different makes and models of equipment has kept both the folklore and the scientific interest alive. The site remains free of visitor infrastructure. There are no installed overlooks, no signage attempting to solve the mystery. Access is unrestricted except for temporary drone bans when interference incidents spike. Research teams are already planning returns with even more stripped-down tools, short-range devices that only log data locally, avoiding the need to transmit in real time, and magnetometers sensitive enough to capture fluctuations that standard survey gear might miss. Whether the cause proves to be a convergence of natural factors, wall geometry, mineralogy, weather, or a less obvious property of the rock itself is unknown. The canyon's anomalies could yet be filed alongside known but rare interference zones, producing an answer that's geological rather than extraordinary. Or they might reveal environmental conditions whose interactions aren't yet fully understood. For anyone visiting, the result is the same. Once you step down into the canyon floor, your connection to the wider world thins to nothing. You navigate by sight, by memory, and by the terrain under your boots. Each wall looms high, and whatever the reason for your instrument's silence, that stillness defines the journey. It raises a simple, unresolved question, one that keeps both scientists and storytellers coming back. Is this a natural geomagnetic patch or something else entirely? And it's not the only landform in recent years to prompt that kind of question. In another part of the world, an absence in the ground began as a visible scar and has since grown far beyond what early photographs showed. The expanding sinkhole of Eastern Europe. In parts of Eastern Europe, a sinkhole has been reported to be growing at a pace that local residents say is faster than anything they've seen in the region. It first drew public notice in photographs circulated in 2022, when it was already large enough to wipe out part of a farm field. Authorities fenced the perimeter and posted warnings, expecting it to behave like typical subsidence sites that stabilize over time. Instead, by late 2025, people in nearby villages were still reporting fresh collapses along the rim, with the shape shifting from a neat circle to a jagged outline where sections of ground had fallen away. The surrounding land had supported generations of farming, fields rotated seasonally between wheat, barley, and root crops. Families lived close enough that the sinkhole could be reached on foot. As the unstable zone widened, officials ordered evacuations for the closest homes. Relocation notices came quickly. Residents shut the doors on kitchens still stocked for winter, unsure how long they'd be gone. Road inspectors marked fissures on rural access lanes, and in at least one instance, a short section of asphalt gave way entirely into open space below. Geologists on site used ground-penetrating radar to probe beneath the surface and streamed the results into mapping software. What they found suggested a complex network of cavities, some large and domed, others a labyrinth of tighter channels, stretching well beyond the visible hole. The pattern mirrored cases in other parts of the world where collapse accelerates even without the trigger of major earthquakes. Research on natural disasters has noted that increased extremes in weather and shifts in groundwater patterns can place unusual stress on infrastructure and geology alike, making sudden failures more likely. Here, sensors also registered light subterranean tremors, hinting at movement deep below the topsoil. Witness accounts added another layer. In cooler weather, several households in a nearby settlement claimed to hear sounds rising from the sinkhole after nightfall. They described them less as the groaning of soil and more like the vibrating ring of metal being struck somewhere far out of sight. Those who tried to capture the noise on personal devices ended up with recordings too indistinct for study, a low, intermittent rumble that could be almost anything. A drone-based inspection in mid-2025 included thermal imaging of the inner walls and airflow tests. The preliminary results, as reported by the research team, indicated channels of warmer air rising from the depths. The measured difference was surprising for an area without known geothermal activity. At the time of reporting, no independent laboratory had confirmed the readings, and scientists on camera cautioned that further controlled testing was needed to rule out surface contamination, equipment quirks, or temporary weather effects. For those living around the site, the science mattered less than the disruption. Rapid subsidence of this kind tends to sever roads, isolate small communities, and force resettlement before clear explanations can be given. Authorities restricted certain routes, limiting access to markets and schools. In conversations, locals compared the drawn-out uncertainty to slow disasters in other hazardous zones, like the villages nearest Chernobyl's Red Forest, where incomplete information and cautious handling left residents in limbo for years. Unlike a factory spill or radiation leak, the sinkhole was not visibly poisoning the air or water, but the same lack of clarity about the boundaries and the official reluctance to let people return meant life could not resume normally. Specialists debated how close to get. One camp argued for pushing cameras and drones into the furthest visible cavities to look for the source of the reported heat spike. The other warned that falling debris and vibration risks could destroy equipment or trigger more collapse. In the absence of consensus, only limited surface-level scans continued, leaving the deepest sections unmapped. Folklore has naturally filled the gaps. Decades before the first photographs, stories circulated about a seasonal lake in roughly the same place, so deep it never froze and so changeable it could drain away entirely by the close of summer. In older tellings, livestock that wandered too near were taken by the earth. None of those accounts spoke of warmth or ringing sounds, but they reinforced the idea of an unstable threshold between surface and void. Standing at a sanctioned lookout, you see its scale in ways the numbers can't convey. The walls step down in light and shadow. Certain layers are slick and damp, others brittle and on the verge of sloughing off. Even on a still day, you can sense the faint pull of moving air as it escapes upward. From a safe distance, collapsed fence lines hang into space and stretches of former cropland now end abruptly at nothing. The known boundary is a working estimate. It will change, though by how much and how quickly, no one can say. The uncertainties persist. What causes warm air to rise against the climate norms of this low-risk seismic zone? How far might the underground chambers extend, and could they merge with another hidden system? Is there a point at which the collapse will slow, or will the process continue until it undercuts the next ridge or drainage corridor? The answers would decide whether former residents resettle, or whether the place joins the growing list of permanently restricted zones. Until then, the site remains under guarded access. A handful of researchers visit under permit. Casual trespassers are turned away. The rim continues to shift under seasonal rain and thaw, and every fresh break adds to the impression that the ground here is not finished moving. Elsewhere in early 2025, attention turned to something very different but no less disquieting: an arrival, not a collapse. Reports began describing an object drifting into view that had been absent from the record for decades, its sudden reappearance in full daylight raising as many questions as the Sinkhole still does. The ghost ship returning to port. In January 2025, dockside cameras and a few early rising fishermen captured the same improbable scene, a large, unidentified freighter moving slowly toward a harbor in Southeast Asia just after first light. Its hull was coated in streaks of rust, barnacles climbing almost to the deck line. Antenna masts leaned at odd angles, some bent, some incomplete. No flag flew from the stern. No ship's name was painted on the bow. Harbor records showed no scheduled arrival, and the inbound vessel wasn't broadcasting its identity through the usual AIS channels. The crew who first spotted it from shore said there was no visible activity on deck, no figures moving at the helm. Maritime officials boarded later that morning. The vessel carried no clear registry markings, raised letters where the nameplate should have been had been removed, and the stern was blank of any country identifier. Company insignia that might once have been painted on the stacks was gone. The general proportions and structure allowed specialists to consult databases of derelict vessels, but they stopped short of confirming any match. Instead, authorities initiated standard protocol. Check IMO numbers, review AIS history if any signals existed, and contact regional registries that could confirm the ship's origin before drawing conclusions about its past. What they found on board was inconsistent with a vessel presumed abandoned for years. Most compartments were in poor condition, with pooled water below deck and mold drifting across crew quarters. But some provisions in the galley were modern, sealed food items printed with 2024 expiry dates and medical supplies identifiable as products released in late 2023. That suggested human presence within the last year. For investigators, it set clear next steps. Trace the supply batch numbers to distributors, search for related port clearance records or fuel receipts, and take forensic samples from high-contact areas to test for recent habitation. Cargo holds contained little beyond rotted wooden pallets. All emergency boats and flotation gear were missing from their davits. Lockers stood open and empty of clothing or safety kits. The engine room appeared dormant, with no signs of recent refueling or maintenance. The mix of neglect and recent provisioning raised more questions than it answered. Officials outlined a limited set of working possibilities. If registry logs confirmed the ship had been declared missing or out of service years before, then a sudden return could indicate undocumented salvage and reuse. If port records elsewhere showed inbound or outbound stops within the past 18 months, then the vessel's path could be reconstructed. Forensic testing of residue in cabins and workspaces could confirm whether the provisioning was connected to sustained human occupation or just a short stopover. Until that evidence is compiled, the ship's movements remain an unverified sequence. Once the ship was secured, port personnel moved it to an isolated berth. Access was fenced, guarded, and limited to authorized teams. Harbor Authority spokespeople explained to local media that bringing an unmarked vessel into a working port required quarantining it from nearby operations. The process included checking for hazardous cargo, assessing structural stability, and mitigating potential pollutants like fuel oil or asbestos insulation. Salvage experts familiar with abandoned ships stressed that containment was as much about environmental safety as it was about solving its identity. In nearby markets and rest stops along the waterfront, word spread quickly. Some local dockworkers expressed unease about being assigned anywhere near the berth until its status was clarified. A few said openly they preferred not to work on shifts where the ship was in view, but without recorded statements or policy actions to match, these feelings stayed at the level of personal caution. Despite the perimeter fencing, curiosity pulled in a steady stream of spectators. From sanctioned public areas, smartphones captured long zoom shots of the ship's bow and wheelhouse. Vendors positioned food carts where passers-by paused for a view through small, uncovered sections of tarp. Drone operators tried for aerial footage from outside the restricted zone, though most were turned away. Inspection teams reported a patchwork of marine growth on the hull. Some sections indicated uninterrupted fouling over many seasons. Others looked as though they had been scraped clean in recent years before regrowth took hold. In enclosed spaces, technicians documented items ranging from outdated navigation charts to containers of unknown powders and liquids in rusted lockers. Without legible labels, samples were sealed and dispatched to controlled labs for chemical identification. Mold from crew areas was analyzed to distinguish between common airborne species and any of concern for human health. By the second half of 2025, publicly released findings were limited. The vessel had been boarded and stocked sometime in the preceding year. It carried no registered identification at time of discovery, and it had been in varied marine environments, inferred from the diversity of attached species. Batch codes on some supplies linked to a regional distributor, but searches of sales logs under corporate and private entities turned up no matching high-volume orders. Port authority records in several nearby countries were checked for undocumented arrivals, with no results yet announced. Its future remained undecided. Scrapping would remove a hazard but might destroy evidence. Moving it to a permanent impound facility could free dock space but risked losing public visibility that encourages accountability. Retaining it in place would allow extended study, but at the cost of tying up a berth in a working port. From a distance, the freighter sits inert, night lights along the dock outlining its profile against the dark water. Daytime patrols pass along the fence's inner edge. Occasionally, a crew boards with respirators and portable instruments, a visual reminder that, for now, it's treated as both an investigation site and a controlled hazard. The open questions are straightforward but significant. Where has it been operating, if at all, during the years unaccounted for? Who stocked it with modern supplies, and why leave it to drift uncrewed toward a commercial harbor? Can registry or AIS data fill the gap, or will the story remain fragmentary, reconstructed only from physical evidence on board? Until those threads are tied together in a documented chain, the freighter remains less a closed case than a protected question mark on the waterfront. While one kind of mystery walked itself into view here, another was emerging far to the north, in conditions that reversed the normal rules of what time is supposed to hide and what it reveals. The Glacier releasing lost time. By mid-2025, global headlines about rapid glacial melt included one location in the far north where retreating ice revealed something that had been sealed away for centuries. Reports described the front of a glacier breaking back by meters in a matter of weeks, a pace faster than earlier climate models for that region had anticipated. When a section of the lower face sheared off, it exposed built structures and objects still locked in clear ice. To the first teams allowed and under permit, the arrangement suggested an abandoned camp, rows of low shapes under frost, objects stacked where they could be reached, and cooking implements preserved mid-use. Researchers confirmed the site lay within a zone historically associated with 18th century exploration. Its appearance echoed other cold-preserved archaeological discoveries, such as the well-known skeleton lake at Rupkund in India, where meltwater exposed remains and artifacts that had been shielded from decay by ice and snow for generations. Here, as at Rupkund, perishable materials had survived. Natural fibers in tenting fabrics, wood still carrying cut marks, even paper held in protective cases. The cold had acted as a long-term vault, slowing or halting the biological processes that would normally destroy organic remains. Some of the printed materials were still readable after careful thawing under controlled conditions. Between the field notes, navigation records, and weather observations, several entries reference conditions also preserved in local indigenous oral history, storms of unusual duration, and complete whiteout that oral accounts placed in the same season. The match between diary detail and oral record added weight to both, showing how multiple lines of evidence can converge when physical preservation allows direct comparison. The objects recovered ranged from hand tools to personal effects. Some items, including food containers, remain sealed. These will stay unopened until laboratory analysis, since their contents could offer data on both provisioning methods and environmental conditions when they were stored. By the time news of the recovery reached other research teams, a coordinated effort had begun to document and stabilize what was exposed. Every removable artifact was photographed, measured, given an accession number, and moved into cold storage. Researchers on site noted how quickly exposure to air was undoing the preservation achieved by centuries of ice burial. Materials that held their shape when encased began to weaken as moisture levels and temperatures fluctuated. Fabrics became brittle. Pigments bled through melting frost. In several cases, items were left in place and covered with insulating material until improved conservation methods could be arranged. Early scientific tests added complexity to the historical picture, where patterns and calibration on navigational devices hinted that the party may have traveled far off the routes depicted on known charts from their era. This could point to either large mapping errors that made their way into the historical record, or a deliberate choice to explore in undocumented territory. While significant, these interpretations remain provisional. They will require peer review, replication of laboratory results, and comparison against independent datasets before any firm conclusion on route or intent can be drawn. Human remains were present, some at the surface, others partially embedded. Their recovery followed established archaeological and heritage protection protocols. Regional authorities oversaw all handling, consulted with relevant cultural and community representatives, and required that any sampling for DNA or isotopic analysis be conducted in accredited facilities. The discussions around them included possible identification of living descendants, and if confirmed, decisions about repatriation or reburial according to local law and cultural practice. These steps mirror procedures used in both heritage work and forensic contexts to ensure respect for the individuals and for community perspectives. Within the research team, opinion differed on how to manage the remaining ice-bound sections. One position held that digging deeper, while conditions allowed, might be the only way to access artifacts before further melting damaged them. Others argued for containment, leaving unexposed material undisturbed until technologies for in situ preservation improved. With the glacier itself shifting and channeling meltwater unpredictably, continued access carried clear safety risks as well as preservation concerns. Conditions on the ground underscored the stakes. The ice wall loomed above active melt streams cutting into the sediment below. Loose gravel and sand carried flakes of textile and wood fibers away in small flows. Tools worked in muted rhythm against the ice, the site quiet except for the occasional deep crack echoing from within the glacier's mass. Each new exposure risked starting the decay process for material that had lasted more than 200 years untouched. Cataloging continued to reveal unfamiliar details. Insignia stamped into uniform items not matched in existing collections, sections of a ship's log written in cipher, and a flag fragment with colors still visible under frost. These finds suggested a level of preparation and a mix of purposes, scientific, diplomatic, possibly commercial. Each interpretation remains tentative, tied closely to ensuring that fragile evidence is preserved long enough to study properly. The site blurred the boundary between archaeological repository and burial ground. Objects and human remains were interwoven in the same context, making separation impossible without altering both records. This complexity shapes decision-making about what to leave in place, what to remove immediately, and what to shield in hopes that colder seasons will buy time. In some cases, leaving sections sealed in ice was judged the least harmful option, even at the cost of delaying study. Across polar and alpine regions, 2025 saw more reports of melting ice exposing long-hidden archaeological sites. These finds reinforce a paradox. The same warming trends that make such discoveries possible also shorten the timeframe in which careful study and conservation can be done. The glacier here has no agency in what it releases. It does not distinguish between a tool, a note, or a body. Once exposed to air, all are on a short timeline before they change, fragment, or disappear entirely. By the close of the field season, protective sheeting weighted with inert ballast covered the most vulnerable exposures. Monitoring devices will transmit temperature and moisture data through the winter to indicate if the coverings are slowing further loss. Whether sealing the past back into ice is an act of preservation or an avoidance of harder choices remains open. What is certain is that each year of accelerated melt increases the likelihood of more such sites appearing in conditions that demand immediate, careful intervention. In this case, careful intervention has meant working within physical, cultural, and legal limits to safeguard both material culture and human remains until they can be studied or returned appropriately. The effort combines science, heritage protection, and urgent climate response in one setting. How those priorities are balanced may influence approaches to future glacier-based discoveries elsewhere. The next location under review faced no such preservation advantage. There, the mystery wasn't about what had been hidden for centuries, but rather about a patch of land that has refused, for as long as anyone can remember, to sustain even the most common signs of life. The forest of never-germinating seeds. In early 2025, surveyors interpreting data from a European satellite mapping project noticed an unusual interruption in the canopy of a dense old-growth forest. From orbit, it showed up as a nearly perfect oval, an open patch where every tree around it seemed to halt along the same sharp border. The area, roughly the size of a football field, was distinct enough that technicians at first suspected an imaging quirk. Ground crews sent on foot found the shape exactly as seen from above. Within that boundary, the ground was clear. No brush, no young saplings, not even the usual scattering of opportunistic weeds common to disturbed forest floors. Local forestry workers who had known the spot all their lives called it nothing extraordinary, just a place that had always been like that. Yet the idea that a forest floor could remain unclaimed for so long carried enough scientific weight to merit further checks. Seeds planted there reportedly fared poorly compared to the surrounding forest edge, sometimes rotting, sometimes pushing out a shoot only to wither early. It was not a case of deep shade, there was none. Rainfall and temperatures were within the regional norms, and sunlight was unbroken across the opening at all seasons. The reason for its persistence was less apparent in the field than on paper. Older references exist. 16th century estate ledgers in a nearby archive sketch the clearing's outline with the note "Old Empty Ground." 19th century farm records mention loads of rich soil brought in to overcome the barrenness, with initial plantings taking on the edges before failing deeper inside. In the early 20th century, an agricultural school did controlled trials with fruit trees set in pits lined with imported soil. For several years, the trees leafed and bore small yields until their roots extended into untouched subsoil. Those roots blackened and the crowns weakened, eventually joining the clearing's other unoccupied surfaces. The most recent sampling in 2025 yielded results still under review. Soil cores from several depths went to independent labs, where analysts noted trace compounds bound tightly to fine clay fractions. The compound's structure resisted breakdown under standard heat and solvent treatments, something that could point to unusual mineralogy or contamination. Geochemists familiar with vegetation anomalies, such as the mineral-influenced fairy circles of Namibia, note that soil chemistry can deny plants a foothold. There, patterns of bare ground form when subterranean termite colonies alter water distribution or when self-organizing vegetation dynamics create competitive zones. In the crooked forest of Poland, another oft-cited oddity, bizarre tree curvature is likely human-induced, possibly for carpentry, but the case shows how physical form alone can preserve a mystery for decades. Both examples are documented, studied, and demonstrate that plant life can behave oddly under specific, localized conditions without any supernatural cause. For the forest oval, conclusive links are missing. No core samples have yet turned up equivalent mineral assemblages or a persistent toxin known to prevent germination across all species. The suggestion of heavy metals is on the table, but it would need robust lab confirmation before moving from hypothesis to explanation. Its status in the local economy has begun to shift. The spot now features in regional hiking routes and in eco-tourism leaflets as an anomaly in the forest. On wetter years, low moss crusts patch across its surface. In drier weather it lies bare, soil cracked and muted against the living green. Some guides pull from enduring oral accounts of an ancient battlefield where nothing would root afterward, of a giant animal resting until its heat sterilized the ground, of faint humming said to rise from the soil surface without clear source. Intermittent technical checks have registered low-frequency vibrations under certain weather conditions, though near-surface wind shear through the forest canopy may be enough to explain them. Visitors occasionally try to capture the sound with handheld recorders, generally leaving with nothing but environmental static. Conservationists have proposed classifying the site as an ecological curiosity to safeguard it from casual disturbance. The case for preservation is straightforward. A long-lived, sharply bounded non-growth patch in otherwise thriving forest is uncommon enough to merit continuous study. Critics counter that formal designation could draw more attention and foot traffic, compounding the disturbance it is meant to control. Speculative explanations continue to circulate. Some focus on geology, suggesting a slow, natural leaching from underlying rock that introduces hostile elements to plant enzymes. Others speak of an ancient impact, meteor or otherwise, altering the surface layer in a chemically persistent way. Still others turn to localized gas seepage, an occasional feature in mineral-rich areas, though multi-week monitoring here hasn't detected sustained emissions. From above, the high contrast between dense canopy and open, uniform ground is striking. On foot, the transition is even more abrupt. Step beyond the line and the forest floor supports grasses, shrubs, and young saplings, all competing for light. Step back across and there's nothing beyond occasional lichen. The edge is so sharply defined it could be surveyed in centimeters. Scientists familiar with forest dynamics note that clearings are normally entry points for edge species, fostering different kinds of diversity. Here, that logic doesn't hold. No novel plant community has taken over, no edge ecology has developed. It is instead an absence without a gradient, a biological break. That quality may be what unsettles people most. As of the last field season in 2025, the clearing remained largely undisturbed in structure. Samples held in archives await more advanced analysis to isolate the compound found in the clay fraction. On site, tourism proposals hang in limbo while the forest continues to press its shadow to the perimeter without advancing. Standing inside it, with a wall of living green in all directions but no life underfoot, has been described by visitors as quietly dissonant. The words vary, but the impression is the same. In a setting where life crowds every available niche, a place where nothing roots reads less like an omission and more like a puzzle. Is the soil here naturally hostile to seedlings, the victim of some past chemical or physical event, or does a longer record of human or environmental history hold the missing answer? The question remains open, and it is the gap in certainty, as much as the barren ground, that invites return visits. Not far in geography but worlds apart in presentation, another anomaly draws people with the same pull of unexplained absence, this time in the form of a sheer cliff face, shaped as if built to host something that, according to both science and living memory, has never appeared. The always dry waterfall. In the high folds of a South American valley, a vertical rock face looms above the surrounding slopes. From a distance, it has all the markers of an active waterfall, dark streaks running straight down, deep vertical channels eroded into the cliffside, and at its base a hollow that looks like a plunge pool ringed by smooth boulders. Everything about it suggests centuries of falling water, but in reality it is and has been entirely dry. No trickle, no rainy season surge. In living memory, it has never run. Longtime residents say their parents and grandparents were just as certain. The cliff never flowed in their lifetimes either. No written or photographic records exist of the falls in action, though local oral traditions insist that the water does return, if only rarely. In those accounts, it appears once in several generations, briefly, before vanishing again. Explanations for what triggers the event vary. Some describe a perfect alignment of rare weather systems in the highlands feeding its source. Others tell of a hidden gate, opened at set intervals by human hands. The interval in these stories is long enough that no one alive has witnessed it, but it remains embedded in community lore. Archaeologists note that folklore of this kind can sometimes preserve genuine historical memory, especially in regions where water management once carried ceremonial importance. The idea of a controlled or intermittent waterfall is not implausible in the context of known pre-Columbian hydraulic works. Surveys in recent years have shown how remote sensing and excavation can uncover such systems. In 2024-25, for example, researchers in Peru's Ayacucho region documented the Palaspata temple's ritual channels, precisely lined and linked to reservoirs, after LIDAR first suggested their geometry under dense cover. In this valley, investigators frame the oral tradition as a lid, one that might point toward forgotten engineering rather than a natural fluke. In April 2025, part of the valley was included in a cross-border geology study using LIDAR to map terrain and subsurface density. Returns from the cliff area revealed anomalies beneath the crest where the falls begin, voids and channel-like structures running toward the edge. The main conduit was broad enough in the imagery to have carried a flow consistent with the stains and grooves still visible on the cliff face. Roughly 2/3 of the way to the drop, scans picked up a dense section unlike the surrounding rock. These findings did not prove the existence of a dam or gate, but they did raise new questions. In other documented sites, sealed channels have turned up as part of deliberate water control, sometimes for agriculture, sometimes for ceremonial spectacle. Here, any confirmation would require physical survey and excavation. If stone-lined passages or intact barriers are present, archaeologists would then test construction techniques, mortar composition, and tool marks against known regional typologies, as they do with other hydraulic structures in the Andes. Heritage officials acknowledge the potential significance but stress the need for caution. Without targeted excavation, the cause of the blockage remains speculative. It could be ancient masonry, a natural rockfall, or mineral deposition sealing the route over centuries. The construction style, if human-made, could link it to the valley's broader archaeological landscape, or stand apart entirely, suggesting a specialized and isolated project. The possibility of re-establishing the flow, even temporarily, quickly polarized those following the find. Advocates point to the scientific value of seeing the system operate. Direct observation might clarify how its builders shaped and routed the water, or reveal downstream structures designed to interact with the falls. Others stress the cultural pull, envisioning what a brief return of the cascade could mean for tourism and local identity. Opponents focus on the risks. Hydrologists warn that centuries of sediment may have built up behind any barrier. A sudden release could destabilize the cliff edge, scour downstream channels, or inundate areas now inhabited. The pressure dynamics in a sealed water-filled conduit are unpredictable without extensive modeling. An uncontrolled breach could also damage whatever structure is causing the blockage, erasing evidence in the process. By mid-2025, without any legal move toward excavation, speculative imagery had already begun to circulate. Tourism boards drafted mock-ups based on flow simulations from the LIDAR data. Renderings showed sheets of whitewater falling into the plunge pool, fanning in spray and mist. Though labeled as projections, some versions began appearing in promotional material under the name Centennial Falls, pitched as a feature in future tour circuits. Locally, the attention is mixed. Some see economic opportunity, others distrust the idea of tampering with something long still. In the oldest versions of the 100-year flow tale, the return of water was linked to upheaval, crop failures, illness, or political unrest. While there's no evidence these outcomes were anything more than coincidence, the warning aspect of the story has persisted, making some residents less willing to pursue a test. Officially, any intervention inside the anomaly zone triggers heritage protection protocols. Before anyone can touch a potential barrier, archaeologists must complete a detailed survey. That work demands secure access for extended periods, something the cliff's unstable upper sections don't allow without major preparation. Loose rock and strong gusts at the crest make even placing survey equipment a logistical problem. At ground level, the visual cues mess with perception. On cool mornings, condensation makes the cliff's stained streaks glisten. Heat haze in midday can give them a ripple mimicking water in motion. Up close, the plunge pool's base is littered with boulders worn smooth from impacts that must have been relentless before the flow stopped. Without water, the cavity is quiet. The sounds are wind along the rock and the scatter of small stones. Whatever lies behind the blockage, be it a collapsed arch or a deliberate seal, the interior remains unseen beyond remote sensing artifacts. No one yet knows whether it holds a steady reservoir fed by hidden springs or an empty channel that last carried water hundreds of years ago. Opening it could restore something, destroy something, or uncover nothing but dry stone. For now, the site remains in formal limbo. Archaeologists compile what they can from surface examination and non-invasive scans. The story of a cliff built for water that never appears continues to feed both community lore and outside curiosity. Without excavation, the place sits between categories: a geological feature dressed in the form of a man-made cascade, or a once-engineered outlet that has outlived its purpose. And while the cliff holds its shape, the landscape of curiosity is never static. In other parts of the world, the mystery comes not from something ancient lying dormant, but from the present day shifting beneath people's feet and on their maps. The city that changes its map. In early 2025, people living in a long-established district of a mid-sized Asian city began noticing something unsettling when they checked their navigation apps. Some streets they'd known for years were plotted differently than before, lines shifted half a block, intersections skewed at unfamiliar angles, and in a few cases, street names had switched. The changes weren't dramatic enough to suggest wholesale redevelopment, but they were consistent across major mapping platforms. Week by week, those digital grids kept adjusting. At first, the easy assumption was a software hiccup. Apps misalign occasionally, especially when updates roll out, but the way these changes synchronized across services suggested something else. In most cities, a handful of widely licensed datasets provide the base for multiple mapping products. An update to one of these authoritative sources can ripple outward, updating hundreds of end-user apps at once. When the error originates in the shared base map, through a coordinate misalignment, digitizing mistake, or outdated survey, it can propagate far and quickly. For commuters using the apps to check traffic or plan bus transfers, the edits were more than curiosities. Routes that had been reliable led to dead ends. Inaccurate one-way indicators caused unnecessary detours. People who didn't know the area well, delivery drivers, visiting relatives, new residents, leaned on what their devices told them, even when the back of the mind feeling was that a turn shouldn't be there. Problems deepened for businesses tied tightly to digital location tools. A small cafe owner said delivery apps began listing their address on a parallel street, creating confusion for suppliers and customers alike. A pharmacy had to field calls from couriers convinced they'd arrived at the right coordinates even though they were several buildings off. In a 2024 Nomad study highlighted in the tourism industry, researchers found that visitors were significantly more likely to choose restaurants, attractions, or shops based on map listings and reviews. The same effect works in reverse. Misplaced pins can mean fewer walk-ins and lost revenue before anyone realizes why. Emergency services were not insulated from the confusion. While crews carry paper map books, many dispatch systems now integrate live digital data. In 2 reported incidents that February, ambulance teams were delayed when the display in their vehicles didn't match the printed grid in their binders. Resolving the mismatch meant relay calls with dispatchers comparing descriptions of nearby landmarks rather than street names, a slower, less precise method when time mattered most. Tour operators had their own headaches. Walking tour that relied on scanned QR codes for wayfinding found the suggested routes misaligned, sending groups to the wrong corners or requiring on-the-fly rerouting. A cultural center that depended on drop-ins from passersby near a plaza noticed foot traffic drop sharply after certain navigation updates. On travel review sites, its location began showing 2 streets away from where it stood, burying it in search results for its actual neighborhood. Staff submitted corrections repeatedly, but each new cycle of base map updates pulled the pin back to the wrong spot. Rather than speculate about physical benches or buildings moving, claims that are notoriously hard to verify without continuous documentation, residents and shopkeepers focused on evidence they could gather. Some compared cache-saved versions of online maps from month to month, highlighting when street orientations or labels shifted. Others printed those snapshots to hand to delivery crews or to pin on notice boards, annotated with the phrase, "Use this, not your phone." The issue underscored how much trust hangs on digital cartography. For property owners, zoning boundaries, tax assessments, and sale contracts all rest on legally recognized coordinates. When a publicly accessible map differs from those official records, disputes are almost inevitable. A misplaced property line on a widely used service might be dismissed as harmless, until an easement application is denied or a utility crew shows up to dig on the wrong side of a fence. because their internal database matches the erroneous version. Municipal reps issued guidance telling residents to rely on official printed maps for boundary and legal matters. But that left people in an awkward bind. Road signs, bus stop names, and newer tourist-facing literature often matched the digital versions, not the printed ones. Enforcement officers were sometimes caught between addressing infractions based on signage visible on the street and the city's own paper records that depicted a different arrangement. Those trying to explain what was happening pointed to the mechanics of base map compilation. Much urban digital mapping starts with municipal GIS data, satellite imagery, or aerial photographs. That data is cleaned, digitized, and sometimes adjusted for projection by one of a few large geospatial companies. Corrections from local governments, contractors, or even vetted volunteers can be applied directly into the base file. If a misalignment slips through and no one at the provider flags it before release, that mistake quietly replaces the previous truth and is exported to every platform that subscribes to that feed. Sometimes, odd patterns emerge when old plans are resurrected during a data refresh. An earlier, incomplete survey might carry features intended for developments that were never constructed. If that outdated layer is accidentally set as current, the result can be a city map that technically matches an archival plan even though reality never caught up to it. It's rare, but in the rare cases it happens, even official channels may take time to reconcile the mismatch. For ordinary people in the district, the effect was immediate and practical. Navigation frustrations mounted. Hospitality businesses lost chance walk-ins. Residents spent more time giving landmark-based directions, turn at the bakery with the blue awning, instead of relying on street names that might or might not match a visitor's map. And while there was no suggestion of anything covert or fantastical driving the changes, the distortion in the day-to-day geography felt real enough. To keep viewers engaged with the puzzle, here's a short challenge. Pick a place in your own city you know well, open the mapping app on your phone, and compare what it shows to a printed street map. Look for mismatches, even small ones, a shifted intersection, a mislabeled road. It's a simple way to remind yourself that the map in your pocket is only as fixed as its most recent update. By late 2025, the affected district's digital layout began to stabilize after a round of corrections. Business owners updated their listings yet again. Delivery drivers reverted to familiar routes. But for a few months, the neighborhood's identity felt partly out of its own hands, caught between record and reality in a way most people never expect from something as mundane as a street grid. It's one thing when a data feed subtly alters your sense of where you stand. It's another when the signals you rely on aren't visual at all, when they come from an unseen source and only appear under specific and not entirely understood conditions. The mountaintop signals. High in the Himalayas, there's a summit with no tourist trail and nothing at the crest but hard ice and wind. Yet for years, some mountaineers equipped with radios have reported picking up an unexpected phenomenon there, a faint repeating pulse buried in static. Those who have caught it say it breaks through only under specific conditions: 3 quick bursts, a pause, 2 longer ones, then another pause. The reports agree on one thing: it only seems to happen when the very top is capped in snow, falling silent once the ice melts late in the summer. Until early 2025, the pattern remained the stuff of climbing stories. That season, 3 independent expeditions deliberately carried rugged wideband receivers to test it. These were not hobby sets. Each could sweep for frequencies and use directional antennas to narrow the source. The teams climbed from different valleys, timing a sense for heavy snowfall when the ice cap would be intact. Within hours of reaching the upper slopes, each expedition logged the same short sequences. The recordings were not dramatic, just low, clipped tones like a steady electronic metronome. At lower altitudes, the data was compared against known sources. It didn't match the sporadic bounce of atmospheric skip common in mountains, and it was unlike any recorded pulsar signal. The sequence was unusually clean in its intervals. When plotted, the timing produced a string of numbers that looked almost deliberate, with a slight irregularity appearing on a repeating cycle. Because no direct study has verified the source, explanations remain speculative. Some geologists suggest a natural electromagnetic process might be possible. Quartz-rich layers under intense cold and pressure can release small electrical charges, a piezoelectric effect which in theory could radiate brief signals. Other natural possibilities in mountainous terrain include coupling between the ground and the ionosphere during specific weather and snow conditions. Those mechanisms can create emissions, but none neatly explain a steady, clock-like sequence without further evidence. The Hestilin lights in Norway, visible, unexplained atmospheric events studied for decades, serve as a reminder that even with field measurements, identifying a clear cause for rare electromagnetic anomalies can take years of systematic work. More speculative ideas circulate as well. Perhaps buried equipment concealed for modern or older purposes activated only when snow and ice form the right conditions. Local stories long predate radio technology. In monastery archives, centuries-old manuscripts speak of a singing mountain whose voice comes only when crowned in snow. The phrases are poetic, a hum carried by clouds, stone that speaks, yet they match the seasonal appearance climbers describe. Getting a repeatable recording is difficult. The final approach to this summit is perilous. Fractured ice clings to steep gradients, overhanging seracs loom above narrow ledges, and weather can shift from clear to whiteout in hours. Oxygen levels slow decision-making. Modern climate shifts make the challenge steeper still. In warm years, the snow shelf may last less than a month. Miss that window and the peak returns to silence. The cleanest 2025 sample came from a two-person team who reached the top in calm weather. They recorded several uninterrupted cycles without visible drift in timing, which leans against unstable natural events. Those files are now being reviewed by labs with signal analysis capabilities. In the absence of a formal survey, some have suggested following the approach outlined in Canada's civilian UAP reporting framework: systematic, transparent data collection across multiple instruments, with recordings available for independent examination. Proposals for excavation or installation of fixed monitoring have stalled. No one knows where to dig, or even if digging would help. The snowpack itself could be part of the effect. Disturbing it might erase the conditions entirely. Remote sensing from lower elevations hasn't detected the signal. The apparent broadcast radius may be so tight that it's confined to the summit's immediate area. That forces every researcher or climber to get within meters of the top to test equipment. The publicity around the 2025 expeditions has attracted radio enthusiasts and mountaineers who normally wouldn't attempt such a climb. Portable receivers hardened for cold now appear on gear lists. Some deliberately aim for heavy snowfall rather than clear conditions in hopes of stronger readings. They know they're unlikely to explain the origin, but hope to add more data points to a very small archive. In the settlements below, the mountain still appears as a silent white peak among many. At camp altitudes, radios pick up nothing unusual on the reported frequency even when aimed directly at the summit. In fair weather without snow, the phenomenon vanishes completely. In snowy weeks, variable storms can still close the approach for the entire viable season. 2 or 3 expeditions might get a shot in a given year, most return with only static. That rarity is part of why the timeline for any serious findings is so long. Clear, verifiable recordings could take many seasons to collect, and the opportunity may disappear altogether if the snowpack recedes permanently. Nothing in the available data firmly answers the core questions. The sequence could be an unrecognized geological process, a quirk of atmosphere and terrain, some form of human technology past or present, or an interaction of more than one of these. Without sustained monitoring, ideally automated stations positioned to survive through the snow cover, the odds of resolving it soon are low. Research on similar anomalies elsewhere shows that patience, careful instrumentation, and methodical data gathering are more productive than single, high-risk attempts. For now, the mountain's role remains the same. Each winter's return of snow revives the effort to climb into its narrow signal zone, record a few faint beats of an unknown origin, and bring them back down for another cycle of analysis. Each summer melt resets the summit to silence, erasing the chance until the next season. That pattern, brief audibility followed by months of absence, fits uneasily alongside more familiar mapping errors, visible ruins, or bounded landscapes. It's a reminder that some places reveal themselves only under conditions set by nature, and those conditions don't wait for human schedules. The 2025 recordings add a few more pieces to the puzzle, but just as often, they raise new questions. And as with many of the year's reports from far-flung locations, the uncertainty is part of what keeps both scientists and the curious returning to look, listen, and try again. In 2025, reports of unexplained locations multiplied, while familiar mysteries gained new layers. Recent surveys showed how satellite and LiDAR mapping can bring hidden sites to light, as with Machu Picchu's concealed terraces and the early ceremonial centers near Peñuco. Extreme environments preserved rare finds, echoing the frozen traces at Rupkund or Antarctic ice cores. And some anomalies, like Turkmenistan's Darvaza crater, Mexico's Zona del Silencio, or Antarctica's Blood Falls, still resist clear explanation despite years of study. These places underline a consistent point. Separating fact from speculation takes time, data, and patience. Share in the comments which you'd investigate, and subscribe for more research-driven follow-ups.